90.3 WHPC now presents Law You Should Know. The law affects every aspect of our lives, our home, our jobs, and our recreational activities. Now, learn about the law and how to protect yourself against the loss of your liberty or property, and learn how to stand up for your rights and seek compensation when you have been wronged. Your host for Law You Should Know is attorney Kenneth J. Landau, a past dean of the Nassau Academy of Law, and frequently lectures to lawyers on ethics and avoiding problems with clients, and to the public on how to choose and use lawyers. This is Law You Should Know on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hi, this is Ken Landau, and welcome to Law You Should Know. Today we're interviewing Karen Gedney, and she's a medical doctor who worked in prisons for many years and has many ideas on prison reform and when prison is not the best options, or some of the different services that can be helpful in prison to reduce the prison population and make all of us safer. Karen, welcome to Law You Should Know.
Thank you.
Tell us about your book and what prompted you to write it.
After 30 years working as a prison doctor, when I left, I still wanted to help the inmate population, but more than anything, I wanted the public to see the prisons through my eyes, because I was a person in the public, absolutely 100% naive. And after you spend 30 years and you're not a captive, a captor, or a prosecutor or a legal person, you look at it more common sense or pragmatically.
And looking at it from your eyes, what are the biggest takeaways that the public is not aware of? What would shock the public the most?
I think what would shock the public the most is that the absolute injustice of who ends up in prison and for what reasons, and that the root causes are not treated, which from my medical perspective made no sense to me whatsoever.
And it's also a waste of money, a lot of taxpayer money, and it's not helping the taxpayer or the person in prison.
Correct.
So what are some of the other reasons for prison reform based on your experiences?
Well, for me, what I look at is I look at other countries that are doing it much better. And if, as an example, you look at Germany, where my relatives are, they have 10% of the prison population per capita and 50% less violence. And when I look at Europe compared to the United States, I am looking at, why does America be so oriented to punishment and prisons and yet have an incredibly violent society on top of it? Makes no sense to me until I learned more and more of what happens in the criminal justice system.
And the criminal justice system and being in a prison may only exacerbate those tendencies. Absolutely,
because the average type of person who has addictions, mental illness, other countries have large safety nets. The United States does not. And jails have become our largest mental health institutions, and they are absolutely not oriented to take care of the mentally ill.
And even if someone's not mentally ill, they kind of become a breeding ground for greater crimes and more crimes. The inmates may learn the wrong information from each other.
Yes, and it's also the conditions that they are under. If you put, especially people that are what are considered pre-trial, they haven't even been convicted yet, but because they're poor, cannot make bail, they end up staying in prison. And then if they are told, hey, if you plead for a lesser case, and they just have to go home and take their children, they don't understand that when they plead, they can have then a felony, even if they are innocent. And then that's like having a tar baby on you the rest of your life.
And it makes them harder to be successful in life and get jobs and education. It's going to stay with them for life, and maybe they are not guilty of any crime.
Yeah, that's a real injustice in my case, because people who do not have money and do not have adequate representation really get screwed.
And you mentioned bail. Does bail serve some type of purpose? Does it protect society? Does it ensure that someone who's accused will return for their trial, or are there other options?
Well, the greatest dilemma for cash bail is obviously how unjust it is for the poor who cannot make a couple of $100 bail. And if you look at it, it does not really make sense to have a cash bail where rich people can do tremendous crimes, pay a bail and out. And if you're someone on the bottom who have done basically not a violent crime, but basically a small infraction, you get stuck in a jail because you cannot make the bail. Now, I would say that the bail should be used for individuals who are severe flight risk or significant violence. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of felonies are called violent, where if you ask the average person, is this person violent? The classic example would be someone who's a teenager driving a car to his buddy goes into the store and then kills someone or hurts someone, and the guy riding the car is really given a life sentence in some states, life without. And that is considered a violent crime, where actually a person on the street and it's your teenager, you would consider, well, he was just stupid to be in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong kid.
Perhaps stupid, but the criminal laws may put some joint responsibility on lesser participants in the crime.
Correct. But the whole business about bail is that a rich person would get their kid out and a poor person absolutely not.
But also your point is that a lesser involved person, there may not be a risk to letting them go out on bail and deal with the consequences.
Yeah.
All the, let's say, robbers should not be treated the same.
Correct.
Is there possibility of parental or neighborhood or community supervision while someone is awaiting the disposition or resolution of the criminal charges, as opposed to locking them up?
Well, that depends on the particular jails. And, people have heard about electronic monitoring, and that can have a place. But also what occurs is you are charged for electronic monitoring every single day. And there are many poor people who cannot afford that. So then therefore they can't get that option either.
Should there be an option for community supervision and rehabilitation even while the person is out pending the disposition of the charge, so they can be put on a better path right from that day one? If they do well, that can always be considered in disposing of the charges?
I have definitely been involved with individuals that were charged with drug possession or drug sales. And fortunately, over time, drug courts have gone up in an amount and quality. And judges now have the ability to take a look at the case and say, okay, instead of prison time, we really recommend this treatment program, this residential treatment that has psych and wraparound services. And that can be costly for the person as well, but it does give an option. And for many people, it significantly helps them from avoiding ending up in prison.
And I know that, do you have opinions on mandatory minimum sentencing? Does that help people who made a one-time mistake or may have been lesser involved, or maybe it was something involving drugs?
Yeah, I think mandatory minimum sentences have backfired in the United States to take discretion away from judges. And I know why they were instituted, because one wanted it to be the same across the board, but judges really have to have the ability to look and understand, is this really a person who had a bad day, or is this person who is really bad and a significant risk to society? And that's what was taken away.
And based on your work and your experiences, you feel that many people are not a serious risk to society with the right support, the right guidance, the right education, with the right training, they can go on and live productive lives and not be an economic burden to the state.
Yes, I think that prisons they have to be a piece of the puzzle for doing the types of things so that person ends up less of a risk when they leave. And many prisons, depending who is running it and at what time, they can actually make a person worse if they don't take care of problems and the person gets punished and solitary and shamed. And these things don't bring out the best in people, but there are many things that can work.
And the idea of locking someone up and throwing away the key, that's a very outdated, expensive, and unproductive notion.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you spend 30 years in the system, I saw that very much in the beginning. In fact, I was told, so what if you're a doctor? They've got nothing coming. They're just lock them up and throw away the key. And over the years, things have changed, but it is very, very much related to the leadership in the prison director and the governor who puts that prison director in a position. And imagine, I did 30 years, I had about 10 directors, and they swung from the dark to the light every couple of years. And that's very unsettling for staff and inmates.
I just want to remind the listeners, we're talking to Karen Gedney. She's a doctor and worked in the prison system for 30 years and is sharing with us her thoughts and observations about prison reform, trying to keep crime down, but better spend money to preventing needless incarceration of prisoners and helping them rehabilitate themselves should they need to go to prison. You do mention, and you've thought about the other services needed in prison. Just tell us more about those.
Well, one of the big things that has to happen is individuals entering prison have to be treated as individuals, not just a block. And everything should really truly be oriented to get them back into society. And that means for an individual who, let's say, has minimal education, then they should be programmed for education and literacy. If you have individuals who have real problems with anger issues because they've been a victim all their lives and just retaliate in anger, there should be psychological programs that address anger and life skills. There are many individuals who have never, let's say, bonded with people, to not have empathy because they have been always stepped on their entire lives. And in my prison, this is just an example, and I saw the dramatic change. There was a puppies for parole program that came into one of our prisons, the Max prison near me. And the impact of the dogs in the prison, the inmates actually training the dogs, and the unconditional love the dogs would have actually reduced that violence in that particular prison system dramatically. And I know that because as a doctor, I took care of all the violent problems in the prison.
And why was that?
I really, it was for me, wild to see, because you have a couple of things going on. You have inmates that are being trained, so now they are responsible for something else beyond themselves. And I think giving service, whether it's to a dog or service in another way, which the inmates can do, service sometimes in their religious circles, sometimes in the literacy program. I formed a Toastmasters group in my prison, being of service with others to help them with communication. I helped form the first incarcerated veterans chapter in the prison. And all of those things is they're able to give back. But with the dogs, it was really that the dog you have, and these dogs were unadoptable in the SPCA, the doggy world. And they were mostly pit mixes that were treated horribly. And so to give a dog a second chance, the inmates were giving a second chance to a dog. And I think they really resonated with that fact. And these dogs turned around just because of love and attention.
And they were able to have some positive outcome, for
Yes.
the dog and in a way for themselves.
And for themselves, yes.
And certain skills like reading,
Yes.
are many prisoners, through no fault of their own, lack literacy skills and other basic skills?
Yes, I was a bit shocked when I created my sort of life skill programs in the evening and I gave homework, and I had guys who actually could not read or write at all, except their name, print their name. And that I had never really seen people like that before.
And that may have helped them become involved in some crime or some unfortunate behavior because they didn't have those key skills to be in society.
Yeah, and that is definitely a piece. I think the other big piece is just they grew up in environments that they didn't learn how to interact with people and control their own emotions. And a lot of those emotions were anger. And because you have both men and women in prison, and when men have emotional issues, it's usually the anger and they explode outward. And women, for the most part, it's the anger and the self-loathing that causes them to have all their medical problems. So they complain an inordinate amount.
So in your view, how can changes in prison help out in those areas?
Well, the person has in prisons usually years, if not decades, inside the system. And all through that period, they have to be in programs. And the problem with a lot of prisons is they might have a couple of programs and that's it. And that is not good. They need to be in programs. Some of the most successful programs I saw were the creative writing programs where they were able to, let's say, process their emotions in a healthy manner.
Karen, first of all, I just want to mention to our listeners that we're talking to Karen Gedney. She worked as a prison doctor for 30 years, and she's sharing her thoughts about prison reform, how we can reduce expenses, reduce the capacity of prisons, and have them perform more beneficial services to the prisoners and society at large to reduce crime, reduce expenses, and reduce recidivism. You're listening to Law You Should Know on 90.3 WHPC and also over the internet at nccradio.org. Karen, I know you have thoughts on keeping people out of prisons, and some offenses they should be given other services and not have to go to prison. Tell us about technical parole violations and other issues that are related.
Yeah, what happens is when an inmate is released, one of the greatest, let's say, things that prisons don't do well is put everything in place so they can actually reintegrate well. It boggled my mind that inmates were sent out of prison in my state with no ID. And many of these inmates had lost connections with family. So trying to get birth certificates and Social Security and all these things are incredibly difficult if you start with zero. And my state, when I first started, would give them $28 of gate money and actually put them on a curb somewhere. And I thought, well, how in the world does anyone survive? And why in the world would you give them $28? And it turned out that was the amount of money for a bus ticket to go to California. And I was thinking, this is not good for...
and they need more than a bus ticket. So
Right.
What else do they need to succeed after prison or instead of prison and stay out of prison?
What they absolutely need is walking out the door, they have to have the appropriate identification. They have to have been in the system where the system actually has started the whole reentry process. That means has helped them figure out where they are going to go in terms of housing. The next thing is if they have any problems, like still having problems with substance abuse, whether you can tie them into any of the residential or drug facilities in the outside world. The legal system has a tremendous amount of obstacles for an inmate in terms of where you can live. And if you don't know where you can live and you live in the wrong spot, that could be a violation of parole and you get bounced back into prison. You can, in terms of these parole laws, you can not report to your parole officer that you changed your address or you went out of state and didn't tell them. And you have incidences where an inmate's on a construction crew, and I live sort of on the border of California and Nevada, and they would go into the California site on a construction crew on a job, and they would get a technical violation and bounce back in prison. And when I would hear these things, I would initially think, you've got to be kidding. You're on a gainful job. Just because that company went over the line, they brought you back to prison. And then I found out about technical parole violations that they don't do another crime. It's just a technical thing of all these parole issues they have to face. And a lot of them, they're given a piece of paper of all these things they're not supposed to do, and they're not really even prepped to understand the implications.
Should the parole officer act as a troubleshooter? Should there be some other kind of advocate? How can we make the system work better?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because I saw the difference where we have in our state a new attorney general, and he, one, was more oriented to not bouncing people back in prison. And he actually told the governor, do you realize that 58% of our population coming back into the prison is on a technical parole violation, means they did not do another crime. Now, if you have that type of number, that is highly uncost effective. And so he changed the culture of the parole board and said, look, with technical violations, you have to act more like a social worker and get them to understand the rules and get them to buy into it and not be so punitive. And that dropped down the amount bouncing back in.
Okay.
So in fact, to me, all parole officers should be oriented for social work, not as punishers.
They should be punishers as a last resort. They should be the good cop and the supportive person first, and help them get the services and flexibility they need.
Yeah, it's sort of like what police should be. I mean, they say serve and protect. That should be first. Absolutely serve and protect. And that is not what you see in a lot of parole officers or at times police.
And the role of parole officer should be, or social worker, as you're calling them, should be expanded. They have to provide support, maybe get them into good programs, into some kind of support network, help them learn and build on their skills.
And the other thing that I think that has to change is there's many individuals who end up with a life on parole, and that particular individual has to pay the parole person every single month. And all of the data shows that if that guy has been out there 4 or 5 years and do everything right, he's not going to come back to prison. And that is too costly for a society to have watchers when if you want it to be safe, and that chance is, 1 or 2% anything can be wrong, you have to let that go.
So we should set them up for success rather than watch them for failure.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Tell us about your book again.
Well, my book, 30 Years Behind Bars, actually starts the day I enter the prison and follows my, let's say, trajectory and the adversities and obstacles I faced. And one of the obstacles I faced is that I was oriented to understand and heal, and I was working in a system which really was oriented to judge and punish. And so in my second year, I was taken hostage and, assaulted and raped and concussion grenaded and SWAT teams. And the guy was killed a few feet from me. And to this day, I feel that there were certain individuals in the prison who would have rather seen me dead or gone. And I made the decision that I don't want to tolerate abuses of power. And I turned it into really a calling that lasted 30 years. And it was because I saw abuse inside the prison. And when I stood up and said, this is not appropriate, and also it makes everything more dangerous for staff.
And who will enjoy your book the most or find it the most informative?
I think the people who would enjoy it the most are individuals who have a bit of a fascination of prison and medicine, and especially people who are interested in those stories of overcoming obstacles. But also, if you really look at the literature out there on prisons, you will see very much from the law enforcement side and from the imprisoned side. But I realized that I was the first person in this country, a female doctor, who ever wrote a book about the prisons.
And you have additional information about your thoughts on your website or samples from the book?
Well, yes, there's a sample there. And also I have blogs related to certain prison issues.
Okay, and just give us your website, Karen.
It is discoverdrg.com.
Okay, I'd like to thank Karen Gedney, MD, for talking to us about prison reform and her experiences as a prison doctor and her many valuable experiences on trying to reform the system and leave everyone in a better place. If you missed any part of the show or you want to tell someone else about it, just remember the podcast is available at nccradio.org, along with many other programs about law you should know. And please join us next week at the same time on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College, for another program on law you should know.
Adopt US Kids presents What to Expect When You're Expecting. A teenager. Learning the lingo.
Today I'm going to help parents translate teen slang. Now, when a teen says something is on fleek, it's exactly like saying, that's rad. It simply means that something is awesome or cool. Another one is totes. It's exactly like saying, totally, just shorter. As in, I totes love going to the mall with Becca. Another word you might hear is jelly. Jelly is a shorter, better way to say jealous. As in, Chloe, I am like so jelly of your unicorn phone case.
You don't have to speak teen to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care will think you're, rad, just the same. To learn more, visit adoptuskids.org. A public service announcement brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Adopt U.S. Kids, and the Ad Council.